How did your family doctor become the one helping your father explain away the bruises instead of reporting them? Dr. Alan Pembroke pressed his fingers against the bruise on my ribcage and asked if I'd fallen off my bike again. My name is Ethan Carver, and I was 14 years old sitting on the examination table in the office, where I'd had every checkup and sick visit since I was born. The bruise he was examining came from my father punching me in the side 2 nights earlier because I'd left the garage door open. Dr. Pembroke had known my family for 20 years, delivered me himself, treated my mother before cancer took her when I was 9, and played golf with my father every Saturday. His fingers were gentle on my skin, but his eyes were asking me to confirm the lie my father had already told him in the waiting room. I said yes, I fell off my bike. Dr. Pembroke nodded and made a note on his tablet. He said bruising was normal after falls and recommended ice and rest. He asked about my ribs, whether breathing hurt. I admitted it hurt to take deep breaths. He ordered an x-ray to rule out fractures, then sent me down the hall to the imaging room. The technician positioned me carefully and took films from multiple angles. 20 minutes later, Dr. Pembroke called my father and me back into his office to review the results. He pulled up the images on his computer screen and pointed to a hairline fracture on my 10th rib. He said I'd been lucky, that it could have been much worse. He said the fracture would heal on its own with rest, no sports or heavy activity for 6 weeks. My father nodded seriously and asked what could be done for the pain. Dr. Pembroke prescribed medication and gave my father printed care instructions. Then he looked at me and said I needed to be more careful on my bike, that ribs were delicate and another fall could cause serious damage. My father put his hand on my shoulder and said, "He'll be more careful, won't you, Ethan?" I said yes, and Dr. Pembroke smiled, satisfied that the situation was properly addressed. Except I hadn't fallen off my bike. I hadn't been on my bike in weeks. The injury came from my father's fist, delivered with calculated force while I was backed against the kitchen counter. He'd hit me there specifically because bruising on the torso was easier to explain than facial injuries. He'd been strategic about where and how he hurt me since my mother died, and there was no one else in the house to witness or intervene. The abuse escalated slowly after her death, starting with verbal attacks and progressing to physical violence. My father had been a different person when my mother was alive. Attentive, involved, present. Her death from breast cancer destroyed something in him, and what remained was an angry shell of a man who blamed me for existing, for reminding him of her, for being a burden he resented carrying alone. The hitting started 6 months after her funeral. A shove during an argument that sent me into a wall, then escalating force, slaps, punches, kicks, always accompanied by threats that if I told anyone, he'd make sure I regretted it, that people would think I was making it up for attention, that no one would believe me over him. Dr. Pembroke had examined me 4 times in the past year for injuries my father claimed came from sports or accidents. A sprained wrist from getting pushed into a doorframe. A black eye from getting backhanded across the face that my father said came from a baseball hitting me during practice. A burn on my forearm from my father grabbing me with a hand still hot from working on the car engine, explained as accidentally touching the stove. Each time, Dr. Pembroke had accepted my father's explanations without question, documented the injuries as accidental, and sent us home with treatment recommendations. I'd tried once to tell him the truth. 3 months ago, when my father was in the waiting room, I'd whispered that my father had hurt me, that the injuries weren't accidents. Dr. Pembroke had looked uncomfortable and said trauma could make us remember things incorrectly, that my father loved me and would never deliberately harm me. He'd asked if I was having trouble adjusting to my mother's death, if maybe grief was making me see my father's discipline as something worse than it was. I'd insisted it was real abuse, that my father hit me regularly. Dr. Pembroke had sighed and said my father had mentioned I'd been having behavioral problems and angry outbursts since losing my mother, that it was normal for teenagers to struggle after a parent's death, but I couldn't blame my father for setting necessary boundaries. He'd suggested therapy to help me process my grief and anger. That conversation ended with Dr. Pembroke calling my father into the exam room and having a quiet discussion while I sat there humiliated. My father had looked concerned and sad, playing the role of devoted single parent struggling with a difficult teenager. Dr. Pembroke had patted his shoulder sympathetically and recommended a therapist who specialized in grief counseling for adolescents. On the drive home, my father told me that Dr. Pembroke had warned him I'd been making concerning statements about being abused, that the doctor understood I was acting out because of my mother's death, but that making false accusations could have serious consequences. My father said Dr. Pembroke had assured him these were normal behavioral issues that therapy would resolve, and that he shouldn't worry about my claims being taken seriously by anyone. He said this while driving, his voice calm and measured, one hand on the steering wheel. When we got home, he hit me harder than he ever had before. Punishment for trying to expose him, for attempting to break the perfect image he maintained publicly. He told me Dr. Pembroke would never believe me over him, that they'd been friends for 2 decades, and the doctor knew him as a good man dealing with tragedy, that any future attempts to report abuse would just make me look more unstable and troubled. I'd learned then that Dr. Pembroke wasn't just passively accepting my father's lies. He was actively helping construct them, providing medical documentation that supported false narratives and framing me as a grief-stricken teenager with behavioral problems. The fractured rib healed over 6 weeks. During that time, my father was careful not to hit me anywhere visible. He'd learned from experience that teachers asked questions about facial injuries or visible bruises, so he focused on areas clothing concealed. My torso, my upper arms, my thighs, places where damage could be hidden and explained away if discovered. School became my refuge. I spent as much time as possible in the library or at after-school activities, delaying the moment I'd have to go home. Teachers noticed I was withdrawn and quiet, but attributed it to ongoing grief about my mother. The school counselor called me in once to check how I was coping. I'd considered telling her everything, but remembering Dr. Pembroke's response stopped me. If a doctor who'd known me my entire life didn't believe me, why would a counselor I barely knew? She talked about the stages of grief and gave me pamphlets about teen support groups. I thanked her and left. In late October, my father broke my collarbone. We'd been arguing about my grades, which had dropped because I couldn't concentrate on homework when I was constantly anxious about when the next attack would come. He'd grabbed me by the shirt and thrown me against the staircase railing. I'd hit hard, shoulder first, and felt something snap. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. My father had stood over me while I cried on the floor and said I'd brought this on myself by being disrespectful. He'd waited an hour before taking me to Dr. Pembroke's office, claiming I'd fallen down the stairs rushing to get to school. Dr. Pembroke examined me, ordered x-rays, and confirmed the fracture. He asked how exactly I'd fallen. My father described me tripping on the top step and tumbling down, landing awkwardly on my shoulder. Dr. Pembroke looked at me for confirmation. I said that's what happened. He fitted me with a sling and said the bone would heal in 6 to 8 weeks, but I needed to be more careful. He made a joke about teenagers being clumsy, and my father laughed. I sat there with my arm immobilized, listening to them bond over my supposed carelessness, knowing I was completely trapped. Dr. Pembroke scheduled a follow-up appointment for 2 weeks out and reminded my father to make sure I took the pain medication as prescribed. My father thanked him for fitting us in on short notice and shook his hand warmly. In the car, my father said, "See how easy this is? Dr. Pembroke asks questions, I answer them, and everyone moves on. You could tell him the sky is falling, and he'd still take my word over yours." I stared out the window, my shoulder throbbing despite the medication, and said nothing. That night, I researched mandatory reporting laws on my phone. I learned that doctors were required by law to report suspected child abuse, that they faced criminal penalties for failing to report. Dr. Pembroke knew the law. He'd been practicing medicine for 30 years. His failure to report wasn't ignorance, it was choice. He was deliberately ignoring signs of abuse and helping my father maintain the fiction that I was just an accident-prone teenager. I couldn't understand why. What would make a doctor violate his legal and ethical obligations to protect a friend? The answer came unexpectedly in November. I'd been at school late working on a group project and missed my usual bus home. I walked instead, taking a route through the residential area near downtown. Dr. Pembroke's office was in that area, in a converted Victorian house with a small parking lot. As I passed, I saw Dr. Pembroke and my father standing by their cars in the lot, having what looked like an intense conversation. I stopped behind a hedge where I could watch without being seen. My father was gesturing emphatically, his face angry. Dr. Pembroke had his hands up in a placating gesture, saying something I couldn't hear. Then my father pulled out his phone and showed Dr. Pembroke something on the screen. Dr. Pembroke's expression changed from defensive to alarmed. He shook his head, said something urgent. My father pointed at the phone, then at Dr. Pembroke, clearly threatening him. Dr. Pembroke's shoulders slumped and he nodded reluctantly. They talked for another minute before my father got in his car and drove away. Dr. Pembroke stood in the parking lot for a long moment, looking defeated, before going back into his office. I didn't know what I'd witnessed, but it was obviously not a friendly conversation between golf buddies. My father had leverage over Dr. Pembroke, something on that phone that gave him power to force the doctor's cooperation. I needed to know what it was. That knowledge might be the key to breaking free from this situation, to finding someone who would believe me and intervene. I became more observant at home, watching for opportunities to access my father's phone. He kept it password protected and never left it unattended, but everyone makes mistakes eventually. The opportunity came in early December. My father was in the shower and had left his phone charging on the kitchen counter. I grabbed it and tried his birthday as the passcode. It didn't work. I tried my mother's birthday. The phone unlocked. My hands were shaking as I opened his messages and started scrolling. Most were work-related or mundane. Then I found a thread with Dr. Pembroke that made my blood run cold. The messages went back months and were explicit. My father had been having an affair with Dr. Pembroke's wife, Carol, before my mother's death. The affair had continued after my mother's funeral. Dr. Pembroke had discovered it 6 months ago when Carol's phone had accidentally sent him a message meant for my father. The conversation thread showed my father threatening to tell Carol's teenage daughter about the affair if Dr. Pembroke didn't cooperate in covering up my injuries. My father had written, You keep signing off on his accidents and I keep your family intact. Your daughter doesn't need to know her mother was fucking her best friend's dad. Dr. Pembroke had responded, "This is blackmail." My father replied, "This is us helping each other. You keep Ethan's medical records clean, I keep your marriage from exploding. Everyone wins except the kid, and he's tough enough to take it." The messages continued with Dr. Pembroke reluctantly agreeing, asking my father to please stop hurting me so badly that medical intervention was necessary. My father had responded that he'd be more careful, but that Dr. Pembroke needed to understand this arrangement wasn't negotiable. I took screenshots of the entire conversation thread and texted them to my own phone, then deleted the sent messages from my father's phone. I put the phone back on the counter exactly where I'd found it and went to my room, my mind racing. I had proof, not just of the abuse, but of Dr. Pembroke's complicity and the blackmail forcing his cooperation. This was evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I needed to get it to someone who would act on it, someone outside the circle of my father's influence. I thought about who to trust with this information. Not the school counselor, who would probably just call my father. Not the police, who might dismiss a teenager's accusations without strong corroboration. I needed someone with authority and no connection to my father or Dr. Pembroke. Monday morning, I went to the school library and researched child advocacy organizations. I found one called the Children's Defense Alliance that had a hotline and email for reporting abuse. I sent them the screenshots, along with a detailed account of my father's violence and Dr. Pembroke's role in covering it up. I included my contact information and medical records showing the pattern of injuries over the past year. The response came within hours. An attorney named Jennifer Roth called me at school and asked if we could meet privately. I told her I could meet after school at the public library. She agreed and said she was already reviewing my evidence and contacting the State Child Welfare Division. Jennifer Roth was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in child welfare cases. She met me in a private study room at the library with a legal pad and recording device. She asked permission to record our conversation and I agreed. Then she asked me to describe everything from the beginning. I told her about my mother's death, my father's transformation, the escalating abuse, Dr. Pembroke's complicity. I showed her the bruises currently visible on my arms and torso. I explained the blackmail arrangement and showed her the screenshots. Jennifer listened, without interrupting, taking notes. When I finished, she said what had happened was criminal on multiple levels. My father had committed felony child abuse. Dr. Pembroke had violated mandatory reporting laws and conspired to conceal abuse. Both could face serious prison time. She said she was filing an emergency petition with the court to remove me from my father's custody immediately and opening a criminal investigation into both men. She asked if I had anywhere safe to stay while the investigation proceeded. I said I had an aunt in a neighboring state, my mother's sister, who I'd stayed with summers before my mother got sick. Jennifer said she'd contact my aunt about emergency placement and that the state would expedite approval given the circumstances. She made several calls while I waited in the library study room. Within 2 hours, she had a court order for my immediate removal from my father's home and approval for emergency placement with my aunt. A social worker arrived at the library to transport me. Jennifer said she'd be in touch daily about the investigation and that I shouldn't worry about my father retaliating. He'd be arrested before the day ended. The social worker drove me home with a police escort to collect my belongings. My father wasn't there yet, still at work. I packed clothes and personal items while the officer watched. The social worker documented the condition of the house and took photos of my room. Then we drove 3 hours to my aunt's house, where I was greeted with tears and fierce hugs. My aunt Linda was my mother's younger sister who'd always been warm and caring during my childhood visits. She said she'd suspected something was wrong based on my withdrawn behavior during recent phone calls, but hadn't known how to intervene. She was furious that Dr. Pembroke had failed to protect me, that my father had been allowed to hurt me for so long. She said I was safe now and that she'd make sure I got proper care and support. The investigation moved quickly. Jennifer filed her petition with the district attorney's office along with the evidence I'd provided. The DA's office assigned a senior prosecutor who specialized in child abuse cases. He subpoenaed Dr. Pembroke's complete medical records for me, my father's phone records, and Carol Pembroke's phone records. The records confirmed everything. Dr. Pembroke had documented every injury as accidental despite clear patterns suggesting abuse. The phone records showed ongoing contact between my father and Carol Pembroke, and the threatening messages between my father and Dr. Pembroke. The evidence was overwhelming. My father was arrested at his workplace on a Friday afternoon. He was charged with multiple counts of felony child abuse, assault, and battery. He posted bail immediately and hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to paint me as a troubled teenager making false accusations. But the medical evidence and phone records made his denials implausible. Dr. Pembroke was arrested the same day at his office. He was charged with failure to report child abuse, conspiracy to conceal abuse, and falsifying medical records. The state medical board suspended his license immediately pending investigation. The arrest made local news. Parents who'd trusted him with their children's care were horrified to learn he'd been covering up abuse. His practice lost patients rapidly. Carol Pembroke filed for divorce within a week of his arrest. The scandal destroyed his professional and personal life completely. My father's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor refused any agreement that didn't include substantial prison time. The case went to trial in the spring. I testified about the pattern of abuse, the specific injuries, my father's threats. I described my attempt to report to Dr. Pembroke and his dismissal. The prosecutor presented the medical records showing clear evidence of repeated trauma inconsistent with the documented explanations. They presented the text messages proving blackmail and conspiracy. Dr. Pembroke was called as a witness by the prosecution after accepting a plea deal. He testified that my father had blackmailed him into falsifying records by threatening to expose the affair with Carol. He admitted he'd knowingly violated his legal duty to report suspected abuse. He said he'd rationalized his actions by telling himself the injuries weren't life-threatening and that protecting his family's stability mattered more. His testimony destroyed any remaining defense my father's attorney tried to mount. The jury deliberated 4 hours before convicting my father on all counts. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The judge said the abuse had been systematic and cruel, made worse by his exploitation of Dr. Pembroke's vulnerability to silence the one professional most likely to intervene. Dr. Pembroke's trial followed immediately. Despite his cooperation, the prosecution pursued conviction to send a message about mandatory reporting. He pleaded guilty to all charges as part of his deal and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with 2 years suspended if he completed community service and paid restitution. His medical license was permanently revoked by the state board. The board's decision detailed his violations and emphasized that physicians who prioritize personal interests over patient safety have no place in medicine. My aunt became my legal guardian. Living with her felt like emerging from a long darkness into light. She got me into therapy with a trauma specialist who helped me process the abuse and understand it wasn't my fault. She enrolled me in a new school where I could start fresh without the weight of my father's reputation. I made friends, joined clubs, started feeling normal again. Jennifer Roth stayed in touch and eventually recruited me to share my story at a state legislative hearing about strengthening mandatory reporting laws. I testified about how Dr. Pembroke's failure to report had prolonged my abuse and endangered my life. The legislators listened carefully, and several said my testimony was powerful and important. The resulting legislation increased criminal penalties for mandatory reporters who failed to report suspected abuse and created a state database tracking reports to identify patterns of failure. Carol Pembroke reached out to me a year after the trials. She wanted to apologize for her role, however indirect, in what had happened. She said she'd had no idea my father was abusing me or using their affair to blackmail her husband. She'd ended the affair immediately after discovering Dr. Pembroke knew, and she'd been horrified to learn it had been weaponized to harm a child. She'd divorced Dr. Pembroke and moved to a different state with her daughter. She said she couldn't undo the damage, but wanted me to know she was deeply sorry. I didn't know how to respond to her apology. She hadn't abused me or covered it up, but her choices had given my father the leverage he'd used to silence the one person legally required to protect me. I eventually wrote back saying I accepted her apology, but needed time before I could fully forgive everyone involved. She understood. Dr. Pembroke served 18 months before being released on parole. He worked administrative jobs outside healthcare. His medical career permanently ended. I saw him once by chance in a grocery store 3 years after his release. He looked older, diminished. He saw me and started to approach, then thought better of it and walked away. I felt nothing watching him leave. My father served 8 years before being released on parole. By then, I was in college studying social work, planning a career helping other children navigate systems that had failed me. My aunt let me know about his release date. I'd prepared for this moment working with my therapist on how to handle the fear and anger. He was prohibited from contacting me under parole terms and a restraining order. He violated it within months, showing up at my aunt's house demanding to see me. My aunt called police immediately. He was arrested for violating parole and returned to prison for another 2 years. I graduated college and went to work for the Children's Defense Alliance, the same organization that had helped me. I became an advocate for children in abusive situations, helping them document abuse, connecting them with attorneys, coaching them through investigations and court proceedings. I taught them how to recognize when professionals were failing their duties and how to seek help from outside their immediate systems. Jennifer Roth became my mentor and friend. We worked together on multiple cases where doctors or other mandatory reporters had failed to protect children. We filed complaints and lawsuits until those professionals faced consequences. Some lost their licenses, some faced criminal charges. The work was difficult and sometimes heartbreaking, but it felt purposeful. I helped children avoid the prolonged suffering I'd endured because one professional chose personal interests over legal duty. 10 years after my father's initial conviction, I stood before a medical board hearing testifying about a pediatrician who'd failed to report obvious signs of abuse in a patient. The case was similar to mine, a doctor prioritizing relationship with an abuser over protecting a child. My testimony helped establish the pattern of negligence that led to the doctor's license being permanently revoked. After the hearing, a medical student approached me and said my advocacy had inspired her to specialize in child abuse pediatrics, a field focused on identifying and documenting abuse in children. She said professionals like me made it possible for people like her to do that work without fear of being isolated or dismissed. She said every child deserved someone willing to fight for them even when systems failed. I thanked her and said, "That's exactly what my mother would have wanted." for her death to ultimately lead to something that protected other children, instead of leaving me vulnerable to violence that nearly destroyed me. The family doctor who'd helped my father explain away my bruises spent 18 months in prison and lost everything he'd built over 30 years of practice. My father served 10 years total and lives now in supervised housing. His construction business gone, his reputation destroyed permanently. The son he abused became the advocate who changed laws that failed him, who helped dozens of other children escape similar situations, who proved that speaking truth eventually forces systems to respond even when they initially protect the wrong people. Justice came slowly and incompletely, but it came. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.